Chapter 20 of Pelle the Conqueror, Volume 1, by Martin Andersen Nexo, translated by Jesse Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Out in the shelter of the gable wall of the house sat Kongstrup, well wrapped up and gazing straight before him with expressionless eyes. The winter sun shone full upon him. It had lured forth signs of spring, and the sparrows were hopping gaily about him. His wife went backward and forward, busying herself about him. She wrapped his feet up better, and came with a shawl to put round his shoulders. She touched his chest and arms affectionately as she spread the shawl over him from behind, and he slowly raised his head and passed his hand over hers. She stood thus for a little while, leaning against his shoulder, and looking down upon him like a mother, with eyes that were tranquil with the joy of possession. Pelle came bounding down across the yard, licking his lips. He had taken advantage of his mistress's preoccupation to steal down into the dairy and get a drink of sour cream from the girls, and tease them a little. He was glowing with health, and moved along as carelessly happy as if the whole world were his. It was quite dreadful the way he grew and wore out his things. It was almost impossible to keep him in clothes. His arms and legs stuck far out of every article of clothing he put on, and he wore things out as fast as Lasse could procure them. Something new was always being got for him, and before you could turn round, his arms and legs were out of that too. He was as strong as an oak tree, and when it was a question of lifting, or anything that did not require perseverance, Lasse had to allow himself to be superseded. The boy had acquired independence too, and every day it became more difficult for the old man to assert his parental authority. But that would come as soon as Lasse was master of his own house, and could bring his fist down on his own table. But when would that be? As matters now stood, it looked as if the magistrate did not want him and Madame Olsen to be decently married. Seaman Olsen had given plain warning of his decease, and Lasse thought there was nothing to do but put up the banns. But the authorities continued to raise difficulties and ferret about, in the true lawyer's way. Now there was one question that had to be examined into, and now another. There were periods of grace allowed, and summonses to be issued to the dead man to make his appearance within such and such a time, and what not besides. It was all a put-up job, so that the pettifoggers could make something out of it. He was thoroughly tired of Stone Farm. Every day he made the same complaint to Pelle. "It's nothing but toil, toil, from morning till night. One day just like another, all the year round, as if you were in a convict prison. And what you get for it is hardly enough to keep your body decently covered. You can't put anything by, and one day when you're worn out and good for nothing more, you can just go on the parish." The worst of it all, however, was the desire to work once more for himself. He was always sighing for this, and his hands were sore with longing to feel what it was like to take hold of one's own. Of late he had meditated cutting the matter short and moving down to his sweetheart's without regard to the law. She was quite willing, he knew. She badly needed a man's hand in the house. And they were being talked about anyhow. It would not make much difference if he and the boy went to her as lodgers, especially when they worked independently. But the boy was not to be persuaded. He was jealous for his father's honor. Whenever Lasse touched upon the subject, he became strangely sullen. Lasse pretended it was Madame Olsen's idea, and not his. "I'm not particularly in favor of it either," he said. "People are sure to believe the worst at once, but we can't go on here wearing ourselves to a thread for nothing. And you can't breathe freely on this farm, always tied." Pelle made no answer to this. He was not strong in reasons, but knew what he wanted. "If I ran away from here one night, I guess you'd come trotting after me." Pelle maintained a refractory silence. I think I'll do it, for this isn't to be borne. Now you've got to have new school trousers, and where are they coming from?" "Well, then do it. Then you'll do what you say." "It's easy for you to pooh-pooh everything," said Lasse despondingly, "for you've time and years before you. But I'm beginning to get old, and I've no one to trouble about me." "Why don't I help you with everything?" asked Pelle reproachfully. "Yes, yes, of course. You do your very best to make things easier for me. And no one could say you didn't. But, you see, there are certain things you don't. There's something." Lasse came to a standstill. What was the use of explaining the longings of a man to a boy? "You shouldn't be so obstinate, you know," and Lasse stroked the boy's arm imploringly. But Pelle was obstinate. He had already put up with plenty of sarcastic remarks from his schoolfellows, and fought a good many battles since it had become known that his father and Madame Olsen were sweethearts. If they now started living together openly, it would become quite unbearable. Pelle was not afraid of fighting, but he needed to have right on his side if he was to kick out properly. "Move down to her then, and I'll go away." "Where'll you go to?" "Out into the world, and get rich." Lasse raised his head, like an old war horse that hears a signal, but then it dropped again. "Out into the world, and get rich. Yes, yes," he said slowly. "That's what I thought too, when I was your age. But things don't happen like that if you aren't born with a caul." Lasse was silent, and thoughtfully kicked the straw in under a cow. He was not altogether sure that the boy was not born with a caul after all. He was a late-born child, and they were always meant for the worst or the best. And then he had that cowslick on his forehead, which meant good fortune. He was merry and always singing, and neat-handed at everything, and his nature made him generally liked. It was very possible that good fortune lay waiting for him somewhere out there. But the very first thing you need for that is to be properly confirmed. You'd better take your books and learn your lesson for the priest, so that you don't get refused. I'll do the rest of the foddering." Pelle took his books and seated himself in the foddering passage just in front of the big bull. He read in an undertone, and Lasse passed up and down at his work. For some time each minded his own, but then Lasse came up, drawn by the new lesson books Pelle had got for his confirmation classes. "Is that Bible history, that one there?" "Yes." "Is that about the man who drank himself drunk in there?" Lasse had long since given up learning to read. He had not the head for it. But he was always interested in what the boy was doing, and the books exerted a peculiar magic effect upon him. "Now, what does that stand for?" he would ask wonderingly, pointing to something printed, or, "What wonderful thing have you got in your lesson today?" Pelle had to keep him informed from day to day, and the same questions often came again, for Lasse had not a good memory. "You know, the one whose sons pulled off his trousers and shamed their own father," Lasse continued when Pelle did not answer. "Oh, Noah!" "Yes, of course, old Noah, the one that Gustav had that song about. I wonder what he made himself drunk on, the old man." "Wine." "Was it wine?" Lasse raised his eyebrows. "Then that Noah must have been a fine gentleman. The owner of the estate at home drank wine too, on grand occasions. I've heard that it takes a lot of that to make a man tipsy, and it's expensive. Does the book tell you, too, about him that was such a terrible swindler? What was his name again?" "Laban, do you mean?" "Laban, yes, of course. To think that I could forget it, too, for he was a regular Laban, so the name suits him just right. It was him that let his son-in-law have both daughters, and off their price on his daily wage, too. If they'd been alive now, they'd have got hard labor, both him and his son-in-law. But in those days the police didn't look so close at people's papers. Now I should like to know whether a wife was allowed to have two husbands in those days. Does the book say anything about that?" Lasse moved his head inquisitively. "No, I don't think it does," answered Pelle absently. "Oh, well, I oughtn't to disturb you," said Lasse, and went back to his work. But in a very short time he was back again. "Those two names have slipped my memory. I can't think where my head could have been at the moment. But I know the greater prophets well enough, if you like to hear me." "Say them then," said Pelle, without raising his eyes from his book. "But you must stop reading while I say them," said Lasse, "or you might go wrong." He did not approve of Pelle's wanting to treat it as food for babes. "Well, I don't suppose I could go wrong in the four greater," said Pelle, with an air of superiority, but nevertheless shutting the book. Lasse took the quid out from his lower lip with his forefinger, and threw it on the ground so as to have his mouth clear, and then hitched up his trousers and stood for a little while with closed eyes while he moved his lips in inward repetition. "Are they coming soon?" asked Pelle. "I must first make sure that they're there," answered Lasse, in vexation at the interruption, and beginning to go over them again. "Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel," he said, dashing them off hastily so as not to lose any of them on the way. "Shall we take Jacob's 12 sons too?" "No, not today. It might be too much for me all at once. At my age, you must go forward gently. I'm not as young as you know. But you might go through the 12 lesser prophets with me." Pelle went through them slowly, and Lasse repeated them one by one. "What confounded names they did think of in those days!" he exclaimed, quite out of breath. "You can hardly get your tongue round them, but I shall manage them in time." "What do you want to know them for, father?" asked Pelle suddenly. "What do I want to know them for?" Lasse scratched one ear. "Why, of course what a terrible stupid question. What do you want to know them for? Learning's as good for the one to have as for the other. And in my youth they wouldn't let me get at anything fine like that. Do you want to keep it all to yourself?" "No, for I wouldn't care a hang about all this prophet business if I didn't have to." Lasse almost fainted with horror. "Then you're the most wicked little cub I ever knew, and deserve never to have been born into the world. Is that all the respect you have for learning? You ought to be glad. You were born in an age when the poor man's child shares in it all, as well as the rich. It wasn't so in my time, or else, who knows? Perhaps I shouldn't be going about here cleaning stables, if I'd learned something when I was young. Take care you don't take pride in your own shame." Pelle half regretted his words now, and said, to clear himself, "I'm in the top form now." "Yes, I know that well enough, but that's no reason for your putting your hands in your trouser pockets. While you're taking breath, the others eat the porridge. I hope you've not forgotten anything in the long Christmas holidays." "Oh no, I'm sure I haven't," said Pelle with assurance. Lasse did not doubt it either, but only made believe he did to take the boy in. He knew nothing more splendid than to listen to a rushing torrent of learning, but it was becoming more and more difficult to get the laddie to contribute it. "How can you be sure?" he went on. "Hadn't you better see? It would be such a comfort to know that you hadn't forgotten anything, so much as you must have in your head." Pelle felt flattered and yielded. He stretched out his legs, closed his eyes, and began to rock backward and forward. And the 10 Commandments, the patriarchs, the judges, Joseph and his brethren, the 4 major and the 12 minor prophets, the whole learning of the world poured from his lips in one long breath. To Lasse, it seemed as if the universe itself were whizzing round the white-bearded countenance of the Almighty. He had to bend his head and cross himself in awe at the amount that the little boy's head could contain. "I wonder what it costs to be a student," said Lasse, when he once more felt earth beneath his feet. "It must be expensive. 1,000 kronas, I suppose, at least." Pelle thought. Neither of them connected any definite idea with the number. It merely meant the insurmountably great. "I wonder if it would be so terribly dear," said Lasse. "I've been thinking that when we have something of our own, I suppose it'll come to something some day, you might go to Fris and learn the trade of him fairly cheap, and have your meals at home. We ought to be able to manage it that way." Pelle did not answer. He felt no desire to be apprenticed to the clerk. He had taken out his knife, and was cutting something on the post of one of the stalls. It represented the big bull with his head down to the ground, and its tongue hanging out of one corner of its mouth. One hoof, right forward at its mouth, indicated that the animal was pawing up the ground in anger. Lasse could not help stopping, for now it was beginning to be like something. "That's meant to be a cow, isn't it?" he said. He had been wondering every day as it gradually grew. "It's Volmer, that time he took you on his horns," said Pelle. Lasse could see at once that it was that, now that he had been told. "It's really very like," he said, "but he wasn't so angry as you've made him. Well, well, you'd better get to work again. That there fooling can't make a living for a man." Lasse did not like this defect in the boy, making drawings with chalk or his penknife all over. There would soon not be a beam or a wall in the place that did not bear the marks of one or the other. It was useless nonsense, and the farmer would probably be angry if he came into the stable and happened to see them. Lasse had every now and then to throw cow dung over the most conspicuous drawings, so that they should not catch the eye of the people for whom they were not intended. Up at the house, Kongstrup was just going in, leaning on his wife's arm. He looked pale, but by no means thin. "He's still rather lame," said Lasse, peeping out. "But it won't be long before we have him down here, so you'd better not quite destroy the post." Pelle went on cutting. "If you don't leave off that silly nonsense, I'll throw dirt over it," said Lasse angrily. "Then I'll draw you and Madam Olsen on the big gate," answered Pelle roguishly. You'd better. I should curse you before my face, and get the parson to send you away, if not something worse." Lasse was quite upset, and went down to the other end of the cow stable, and began the afternoon's cleaning, knocking and pulling his implements about. In his anger he loaded the wheelbarrow too full, and then could neither go one way nor the other, as his feet slipped. Pelle came down with the gentlest of faces. "Mayn't I wheel the barrow out?" he said. "Your wooden shoes aren't so firm on the stones." Lasse growled some reply, and let him take it. For a very short time he was cross, but it did no good. The boy could be irresistible when he liked. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Pelle the Conqueror, Volume 1, by Martin Andersen Nexo, translated by Jesse Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Pelle had been to confirmation class and was now sitting in the servants' room eating his dinner, boiled herring and porridge. It was Saturday, and the bailiff had driven into the town, so Erik was sitting over the stove. He never said anything of his own accord, but always sat and stared, and his eyes followed Pelle's movements backward and forward between his mouth and his plate. He always kept his eyebrows raised, as if everything were new to him. They had almost grown into that position. In front of him stood a mug of beer in a large pool, for he drank constantly, and spilt some every time. Fair Maria was washing up, and looked in every now and then to see if Pelle were finished. When he licked his horn spoon clean, and threw it into the drawer, she came in with something on a plate. They had had roast loin of pork for dinner upstairs. "Here's a little taste for you," she said. "I expect you're still hungry. What'll you give me for it?" She kept the plate in her hand and looked at him with a coaxing smile. Pelle was still very hungry, ravenous, and he looked at the tidbit until his mouth watered. Then he dutifully put up his lips, and Maria kissed him. She glanced involuntarily at Eric, and a gleam of something passed over his foolish face, like a faint reminiscence. "There sits that great Gaby making a mess," she said, scolding as she seized the beer mug from him, held it under the edge of the table, and with her hand swept the spilt beer into it. Pelle set to work upon the pork without troubling about anything else, but when she had gone out, he carefully spat down between his legs, and went through a small cleansing operation with the sleeve of his blouse. When he was finished, he went into the stable and cleaned out the mangers, while Lasse curried the cows. It was all to look nice for Sunday. While they worked, Pelle gave a full account of the day's happenings, and repeated all that the parson had said. Lasse listened attentively, with occasional little exclamations. "Think of that! Well, I never! So David was a buck like that, and yet he walked in the sight of God all the same. Well, God's long-suffering is great. There's no mistake about that." There was a knock at the outer door. It was one of Kalle's children, with the message that grandmother would like to bid them good-bye before she passed away. "Then she can't have long to live," exclaimed Lasse. "It'll be a great loss to them all, so happy as they've been together. But there'll be a little more food for the others, of course." They agreed to wait until they were quite finished, and then steal away. For if they asked to be let off early, they would not be likely to get leave for the funeral. "And that'll be a day's feasting, with plenty of food and drink, if I know anything of Brother Kalle," said Lasse. When they had finished their work and had their supper, they stole out through the outside door into the field. Lasse had heaped up the quilt and put an old woolly cap just sticking out at the pillow end. In a hurry, it could easily be mistaken for the hair of a sleeper, if anyone came to see. When they had got a little way, Lasse had to go back once more to take precautions against fire. It was snowing gently and silently, and the ground was frozen, so that they could go straight on over everything. Now that they knew the way, it seemed no distance at all, and before they knew where they were, the fields came to an end, and the rock began. There was a light in the cottage. Kalle was sitting up waiting for them. "Grandmother hasn't long to live," he said, more seriously than Lasse ever remembered to have heard him speak before. Kalle opened the door to grandmother's room and whispered something, to which his wife answered softly out of the darkness. "Oh, I'm awake," said the old woman in a slow, monotonous voice. "You can speak out, for I am awake." Lasse and Pelle took off their leather shoes and went in their stockings. "Good evening, grandmother," they both said solemnly. "And the peace of God," Lasse added. "Well, here I am," said the old woman, feebly patting the quilt. She had big woolen gloves on. "I took the liberty of sending for you, for I haven't long to live now. How are things going on in the parish? Have there been any deaths?" "No, not that I know of," answered Lasse. "But you look so well, grandmother, so fat and rosy. We shall see you going about again in 2 or 3 days." "Oh, I dare say," said the old woman, smiling indulgently. "I suppose I look like a young bride after her first baby, eh? But thank you for coming. It's as if you belonged to me. Well, now I've been sent for, and I shall depart in peace. I've had a good time in this world, and haven't anything to complain of. I had a good husband and a good daughter, not forgetting Kalle there. And I got my sight back, so that I saw the world once more." "But you only saw it with one eye, like the birds, grandmother," said Kalle, trying to laugh. "Yes, yes, but that was quite good enough. There was so much that was new since I lost my sight. The wood had grown bigger, and a whole family had grown up without my quite knowing it. Ah, yes, it has been good to live in my old age, and have them all about me. Kalle and Maria and the children, and all of my own age have gone before me." It's been nice to see what became of them all." "How old are you now, grandmother?" asked Lasse. "Kalle has looked it up in the church book, and from that I ought to be almost 80, but that can scarcely be right." "Yes, it's right enough," said Kalle, "for the parson looked it up for me himself." "Well, well, then the time's gone quickly, and I shouldn't at all mind living a little longer, if it was God's will. But the grave's giving warning. I notice it in my eyelids." The old woman had a little difficulty in breathing, but kept on talking. "You're talking far too much, mother," said Maria. "Yes, you ought to be resting and sleeping," said Lasse. "Hadn't we better say good-bye to you?" "No, I really must talk, for it'll be the last time I see you, and I shall have plenty of time to rest. My eyes are so light, thank God, and I don't feel the least bit sleepy." "Grandmother hasn't slept for a whole week, I think," said Kalle doubtfully. "And why should I sleep away the last of the time I shall have here, when I shall get plenty of time for that afterward? At night, when you others are asleep, I lie and listen to your breathing, and feel glad that you're all so well. Or I look at the heather broom and think of Anders and all the fun we had together." She lay silent for a little while, getting her breath, while she gazed at the withered bunch of heather hanging from a beam. "He gathered that for me the last time we lay in the flowering heather. He was so uncommonly fond of the heather, was Anders. And every year when it flowered, he took me out of my bed and carried me out there, every year until he was called away. I was always as new for him as on the first day, and so happiness and joy took up their abode in my heart." "Now, mother, you ought to be quiet and not talk so much," said Maria, smoothing the old woman's pillow. But she would not be silenced, though her thoughts shifted a little. "Yes, my teeth were hard to get and hard to lose, and I brought my children into the world with pain, and laid them in the grave with sorrow, one after another. But except for that, I've never been ill, and I've had a good husband. He had an eye for God's creations, and we got up with the birds every summer morning, and went out onto the heath and saw the sun rise out of the sea before we set about our day's work." The old woman's slow voice died away, and it was as though a song ceased to sound in their ears. They sat up and sighed. "Ah, yes," said Lasse. "The voice of memory is pleasant." "What about you, Lasse?" said the old woman suddenly. "I hear you're looking for a wife." "Am I?" exclaimed Lasse in alarm. Pelle saw Kalle wink at Maria, so they knew about it too. "Aren't you soon coming to show us your sweetheart?" asked Kalle. "I hear it's a good match." "I don't in the least know what you're talking about," said Lasse, quite confused. "Well, well, you might do worse than that," said the grandmother. "She's good enough, from what I know. I hope you'll suit one another like Anders and me. It was a happy time. The days when we went about and each did our best, and the nights when the wind blew. It was good then to be two, to keep one another warm." "You've been very happy in everything, grandmother," exclaimed Lasse. "Yes, and I'm departing in peace, and can lie quiet in my grave. I've not been treated unfairly in any way, and I've got nothing to haunt anyone for. If only Kalle takes care to have me carried out feet first, I don't expect I shall trouble you. You just come and visit us now and then if you like. We shan't be afraid to welcome you, for we've been so happy together here," said Kalle. "No, you never know what your nature may be in the next life. You must promise to have me carried out feet first. I don't want to disturb your night's rest, so hard as you two have to work all day. And besides, you've had to put up with me long enough. And it'll be nice for you to be by yourselves for once. And there'll be a bit more for you to eat after this." Maria began to cry. "Now look here," exclaimed Kalle testily. "I won't hear any more of that nonsense, for none of us have had to go short because of you. If you aren't good, I shall have a big party after you, for joy that you're gone." "No, you won't," said the old woman quite sharply. "I won't hear of a 3 days' wake. Promise me now, Maria, that you won't go and ruin yourselves to make a fuss over a poor old soul like me. But you must ask the nearest neighbors in the afternoon, with Lasse and Pelle, of course. And if you ask Hans Henrik, perhaps he'd bring his concertina with him, and you could have a dance in the barn." Kalle scratched the back of his head. "Then hang it, you must wait until I've finished threshing, for I can't clear the floor now. Couldn't we borrow Jens Kure's horse, and take a little drive over the heath in the afternoon?" "You might do that too, but the children are to have a share in whatever you settle to do. It'll be a comfort to think they'll have a happy day out of it, for they don't have too many holidays, and there's money for it, you know." "Yes, would you believe it, Lasse? Grandmother's got together 50 kronas that none of us knew anything about, to go toward her funeral party. I've been putting by for it for 20 years now, for I'd like to leave the world in a decent way, and without pulling the clothes off my relations' backs. My grave clothes are all ready too, for I've got my wedding chemise lying by. It's only been used once, and more than that, and my cap I don't want to have on." "But that's so little," objected Maria. "Whatever will the neighbors say if we don't dress you properly?" "I don't care," answered the old woman decidedly. "That's how Anders liked me best, and it's all I've worn in bed these 60 years, so there." And she turned her head to the wall. "You shall have it all just as you like, mother," said Maria. The old woman turned round again and felt for her daughter's hand on the quilt. "And you must make rather a soft pillow for my old head, for it's become so difficult to find rest for it." "We can take one of the baby's pillows and cover it with white," said Maria. "Thank you. And then I think you should send to Jacob Christians for the carpenter tomorrow. He's somewhere about anyhow, and let him measure me for the coffin. Then I could have my say as to what it's to be like. Kalle's so free with his money." The old woman closed her eyes. She had tired herself out after all. "Now I think we'll creep out into the other room and let her be quiet," whispered Kalle, getting up. But at that she opened her eyes. "Are you going already?" she asked. "We thought you were asleep, grandmother," said Lasse. "No, I don't suppose I shall sleep any more in this life. My eyes are so light, so light. Well, good-bye to you, Lasse and Pelle. May you be very, very happy as I've been. Maria was the only one death spared, and she's been a good daughter to me. And Kalle's been as good and kind to me as if I'd been his sweetheart. I had a good husband, too, who chopped firewood for me on Sundays, and got up in the night to look after the babies when I was lying in. We were really well off. Lead weights in the clock and plenty of firing, and he promised me a trip to Copenhagen. I churned my first butter in a bottle, for we had no churn to begin with, and I had to break the bottle to get it out, and then he laughed, for he always laughed when I did anything wrong. And how glad he was when each baby was born. Many a morning did he wake me up, and we went out to see the sun come up out of the sea. 'Come and see, Anna,' he would say. 'The heather's come into bloom in the night.' But it was only the sun that shed its red over it. It was more than 2 miles to our nearest neighbor, but he didn't care for anything as long as he had me. He found his greatest pleasures in me, poor as I was, and the animals were fond of me too. Everything went well with us on the whole." She lay moving her head from side to side, and the tears were running down her cheeks. She no longer had difficulty in breathing, and one thing recalled another, and fell easily into one long tone from her lips. She probably did not know what she was saying, but could not stop talking. She began at the beginning and repeated the words evenly and monotonously, like one who was carried away and must talk. "Mother," said Maria anxiously, putting her hands on her mother's shaking head. "Recollect yourself, mother." The old woman stopped and looked at her wonderingly. "Ah, yes," she said. "Memories came upon me so fast. I almost think I could sleep a little now." Lasse rose and went up to the bed. "Goodbye, grandmother," he said, "and a pleasant journey, in case we shouldn't meet again." Pelle followed him and repeated the words. The old woman looked at them inquiringly, but did not move. Then Lasse gently took her hand, and then Pelle, and they stole out into the other room. "Her flame's burning clear to the end," said Lasse when the door was shut. Pelle noticed how freely their voices rang again. "Yes, she'll be herself to the very end. There's been extra good timber in her. The people about here don't like our not having the doctor to her. What do you think? Shall we go to the expense?" "I don't suppose there's anything more the matter with her than that she can't live any longer," said Lasse thoughtfully. "No, and she won't hear of it. If he could only keep her in life a little while longer." "Yes, times are hard," said Lasse, and went round to look at the children. They were all asleep, and their room seemed heavy with their breathing. "The flock's getting much smaller." "Yes, one or two fly away from the nest pretty well every year," answered Kalle. "And now I suppose we shan't have any more. It's an unfortunate figure we've stopped at, a horrid figure. But Maria's become deaf in that ear, and I can't do anything alone." Kalle had got back his roguish look. "I'm sure we can do very well with what we've got," said Maria. "When we take Anna's too, it makes 14. "Oh, yes, count the others too, and you'll get off all the easier," said Kalle teasingly. Lasse was looking at Anna's child, which lay side by side with Kalle's 13th. "She looks healthier than her aunt," he said. "You'd scarcely think they were the same age. She's just as red as the other's pale." "Yes, there is a difference," Kalle admitted, looking affectionately at the children. "It must be that Anna's has come from young people, while our blood's beginning to get old. And then the ones that come the wrong side of the blanket always thrive best, like our Albert, for instance. He carries himself quite differently from the others. Did you know, by the by, that he's to get a ship of his own next spring?" "No, surely not. Is he really going to be a captain?" said Lasse, in the utmost astonishment. "It's Kongstrup that's at the back of that. That's between ourselves, of course." "Does the father of Anna's child still pay what he's bound to?" asked Lasse. "Yes, he's honest enough. We get 5 kronas a month for having the child, and that's a good help toward expenses." Maria had placed a dram, bread, and a saucer of dripping on the table, and invited them to take their places at it. "You're holding out for a long time at Stone Farm," said Kalle when they were seated. "Are you going to stay there all your life?" he asked, with a mischievous wink. "It's not such a simple matter to strike out into the deep," said Lasse evasively. "Oh, we shall soon be hearing news from you, shan't we?" asked Maria. Lasse did not answer. He was struggling with a crust. "Oh, but do cut off the crust if it's too much for your teeth," said Maria. Every now and then she listened at her mother's door. "She's dropped off after all, poor old soul," she said. Kalle pretended to discover the bottle for the first time. "What? Why, we've got gin on the table too, and not one of us has smelt it," he exclaimed, and filled their glasses for the 3rd time. Then Maria corked the bottle. "Do you even grudge us our food?" he said, making great eyes at her. What a rogue he was! And Maria stared at him with eyes that were just as big, and said, "Ja, you want to fight, do you?" It quite warmed Lasse's heart to see their happiness. "How's the farmer at Stone Farm? I suppose he's got over the worst now, hasn't he?" said Kalle. "Well, I think he's as much a man as he'll ever be. A thing like that leaves its mark upon anyone," answered Lasse. Maria was smiling, and as soon as they looked at her, she looked away. "Yes, you may grin," said Lasse, "but I think it's sad." Upon which Maria had to go out into the kitchen to have her laugh out. "That's what all the women do at the mere mention of his name," said Kalle. "It's a sad change. Today red, tomorrow dead. Well, she's got her own way in one thing, and that is that she keeps him to herself, in a way. But to think that he can live with her after that! They seem fonder of one another than they ever were before. He can't do without her for a single minute. But of course he wouldn't find anyone else to love him now. What a queer sort of devilment love is. But we must see about getting home." "Well, I'll send you word when she's to be buried," said Kalle, when they got outside the house. "Yes, do. And if you should be in want of a 10-krone note for the funeral, let me know. Goodbye, then." End of chapter 21.
This audiobook is brought to you by Full Audiobooks. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon if you love audiobooks.
Chapter 22 of Pelle the Conqueror, Volume 1, by Martin Andersen Nexo, translated by Jesse Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Grandmother's funeral was still like a bright light behind everything that one thought and did. It was like certain kinds of food that leave a pleasant taste in the mouth long after they have been eaten and done with. Kalle had certainly done everything to make it a festive day. There was an abundance of good things to eat and drink, and no end to its comical tricks. And, sly dog that he was, he had found an excuse for asking Madame Olsen. It was really a nice way of making the relation a legitimate one. It gave Lasse and Pelle enough to talk about for a whole month, and after the subject was quite talked out and laid on one side for other things, it remained in the background as a sense of well-being of which no one quite knew the origin. But now spring was advancing, and with it came troubles. Not the daily trifles that could be bad enough, but great troubles that darkened everything, even when one was not thinking about them. Pelle was to be confirmed at Easter, and Lasse was at his wits' end to know how he was going to get him all that he would need: new clothes, new cap, new shoes. The boy often spoke about it. He must have been afraid of being put to shame before the others that day in church. "It'll be all right," said Lasse, but he himself saw no way at all out of the difficulty. At all the farms where the good old customs prevailed, the master and mistress provided it all. Out here, everything was so confoundedly newfangled, with prompt payments that slipped away between one's fingers. 100 kronas a year in wages seemed a tremendous amount when one thought of it all in one, but you only got them gradually, a few öres at a time, without your being able to put your finger anywhere and say, "You got a good round sum there." "Yes, yes, it'll be all right," said Lasse aloud, when he had got himself entangled in absurd speculations, and Pelle had to be satisfied with this. There was only one way out of the difficulty: to borrow the money from Madame Olsen, and that Lasse would have to come to in the end, loath as he was to do it. But Pelle must not know anything about it. Lasse refrained as long as he possibly could, hoping that something or other would turn up to free him from the necessity of so disgraceful a proceeding as borrowing from his sweetheart. But nothing happened, and time was passing. One morning he cut the matter short. Pelle was just setting out for school. "Will you run into Madame Olsen's and give her this?" he said, handing the boy a packet. "It's something she promised to mend for us." Inside on the paper was the large cross that announced Lasse's coming in the evening. From the hills, Pelle saw that the ice had broken up in the night. It had filled the bay for nearly a month with a rough, compact mass, upon which you could play about as safely as on dry land. This was a new side of the sea, and Pelle had carefully felt his way forward with the tips of his wooden shoes, to the great amusement of the others. Afterward, he learned to walk about freely on the ice without constantly shivering at the thought that the great fish of the sea were going about just under his wooden shoes, and perhaps were only waiting for him to drop through. Every day he went out to the high rampart of pack ice that formed the boundary about a mile out, where the open water moved round in the sunshine like a green eye. He went out because he would do what the others did, but he never felt safe on the sea. Now it was all broken up, and the bay was full of heaving ice floes that rubbed against one another with a crackling sound, and the pieces farthest out, carrying bits of the rampart, were already on their way out to sea. Pelle had performed many exploits out there, but was really quite pleased that it was now packing up and taking its departure, so that it would once more be no crime to stay on dry land. Old Fris was sitting in his place. He never left it now during a lesson, however badly things might go down in the class, but contented himself with beating on the desk with his cane. He was little more than a shadow of his former self. His head was always shaking, and his hands were often incapable of grasping an object. He still brought the newspaper with him, and opened it out at the beginning of the lesson, but he did not read. He would fall into a dream, sitting bolt upright, with his hands on the desk and his back against the wall. At such times the children could be as noisy as they liked, and he did not move. Only a slight change in the expression of his eyes showed that he was alive at all. It was quieter in school now. It was not worth while teasing the master, for he scarcely noticed it, and so the fun lost most of its attraction. A kind of court of justice had gradually formed among the bigger boys. They determined the order of the school lessons, and disobedience and disputes as to authority were respectively punished and settled in the playground, with fists and tips of wooden shoes. The instruction was given as before, by the cleverer scholars teaching what they knew to the others. There was rather more arithmetic and reading than in Fris's time, but on the other hand, the hymns suffered. It still sometimes happened that Fris woke up and interfered in the instruction. "Hymns!" he would cry in his feeble voice, and strike the desk from habit, and the children would put aside what they were doing to please the old man, and begin repeating some hymn or other, taking their revenge by going through one verse over and over again for a whole hour. It was the only real trick they played the old man, and the joke was all on their side, for Fris noticed nothing. Fris had so often talked of resigning his post, but now he did not even think of that. He shuffled to and from school at the regular times, probably without even thinking he did it. The authorities really had not the heart to dismiss him. Except in the hymns, which came off with rather short measure, there was nothing to say against him as teacher, for no one had ever yet left his school without being able both to write his name and to read a printed book, if it were in the old type. The new-fashioned printing with Latin letters Fris did not teach, although he had studied Latin in his youth. Fris himself probably did not feel the change, for he had ceased to feel both for himself and for others. None now brought their human sorrows to him, and found comfort in a sympathetic mind. His mind was not there to consult. It floated outside him, half detached, as it were, like a bird that is unwilling to leave its old nest and set out on a flight to the unknown. It must have been the fluttering mind that his eyes were always following when they dully gazed about into vacancy. But the young men who came home to winter in the village, and went to Fris as an old friend, felt the change. For them there was now an empty place at home. They missed the old growler, who, though he hated them in the lump at school, loved them all afterward, and was always ready with his ridiculous "He was my best boy" about each and all of them, good and bad alike. The children took their playtime early, and rushed out before Pelle had given the signal. and Fris trotted off as usual into the village, where he would be absent the customary 2 hours. The girls gathered in a flock to eat their dinners, and the boys dashed about the playground like birds let loose from a cage. Pelle was quite angry at the insubordination, and pondered over a way of making himself respected, for today he had had the other big boys against him. He dashed over the playground like a circling gull, his body inclined and his arms stretched out like a pair of wings. Most of them made room for him, and those who did not move willingly were made to do so. His position was threatened, and he kept moving incessantly, as if to keep the question undecided until a possibility of striking presented itself. This went on for some time. He knocked some over and hit out at others in his flight, while his offended sense of power grew. He wanted to make enemies of them all. They began to gather up by the gymnastic apparatus, and suddenly he had the whole pack upon him. He tried to rise and shake them off, flinging them hither and thither, but all in vain. Down through the heap came their remorseless knuckles and made him grin with pain. He worked away indefatigably, but without effect, until he lost patience and resorted to less scrupulous tactics, thrusting his fingers into eyes, or attacking noses, windpipes, or any vulnerable part he could get at. That thinned them out, and he was able to rise and fling a last little fellow across the playground. Pelle was well bruised and quite out of breath, but contented. They all stood by gaping and let him brush himself down. He was the victor. He went across to the girls with his torn blouse, and they put it together with pins and gave him sweets. And in return he fastened 2 of them together by their plaits, and they screamed and let him pull them about without being cross. It was all just as it should be. But he was not quite secure after his victory. He could not, like Henry Boker in his time, walk right through the whole flock with his hands in his pockets directly after a battle, and look as if they did not exist. He had to keep stealing glances at them while he strolled down to the beach, and tried with all his might to control his breathing, for next to crying, to be out of breath was the greatest disgrace that could happen to you. Pelle walked along the beach, regretting that he had not leaped upon them again at once while the flush of victory was still upon him. It was too late now. If he had, it might perhaps have been said of him too, that he could lick all the rest of the class together, and now he must be content with being the strongest boy in the school. A wild war whoop from the class made him start. The whole swarm of boys was coming round the end of the house with sticks and pieces of wood in their hands. Pelle knew what was at stake if he gave way, and therefore forced himself to stand quietly waiting, although his legs twitched. But suddenly they made a wild rush at him, and with a spring he turned to fly. There lay the sea barring his way, closely packed with heaving ice. He ran out onto an ice floe, leaped from it to the next, which was not large enough to bear him, had to go on. The idea of flight possessed him and made the fear of what lay behind overpoweringly great. The lumps of ice gave way beneath him, and he had to leap from piece to piece. His feet moved as fast as fingers over the notes of a piano. He just noticed enough to take the direction toward the harbor breakwater. The others stood gaping at the beach while Pelle danced upon the water, like a stone making ducks and drakes. The pieces of ice bobbed under as soon as he touched them, or turned up on edge, but Pelle came and slid by with a touch, flung himself to one side with lightning rapidity, and changed his aim in the middle of a leap like a cat. It was like a dance on red-hot iron, so quickly did he pick up his feet and spring from one place to another. The water spurted up from the pieces of ice as he touched them, and behind him stretched a crooked track of disturbed ice and water, right back to the place where the boys stood and held their breath. There was nobody like Pelle. Not one of them could do what he had done there. When with a final leap he threw himself upon the breakwater, they cheered him. Pelle had triumphed in his flight. He lay upon the breakwater, exhausted and gasping for breath, and gazed without interest at a brig that had cast anchor off the village. A boat was rowing in, perhaps with a sick man to be put in quarantine. The weather-beaten look of the vessel told of her having been out on a winter voyage in ice and heavy seas. Fishermen came down from the cottages and strolled out to the place where the boat would come in, and all the school children followed. In the stern of the boat sat an elderly weather-beaten man with a fringe of beard round his face. He was dressed in blue, and in front of him stood a sea-chest. "Why, it's Boatswain Olsen," Pelle heard one fisherman say. Then the man stepped ashore and shook hands with them all, and the fishermen and the school-children closed round him in a dense circle. Pelle made his way up, creeping along behind boats and sheds, and as soon as he was hidden by the school building, he set off running straight across the fields to Stone Farm. His vexation burnt his throat, and a feeling of shame made him keep far away from houses and people. The parcel, that he had had no opportunity of delivering in the morning, was like a clear proof to everybody of his shame, and he threw it into the marl pit as he ran. He would not go through the farm, but thundered on the outside door to the stable. "Have you come home already?" exclaimed Lasse, pleased. Now Madam Olsen's husband's come home," panted Pelle, and went past his father without looking at him. To Lasse it was as if the world had burst, and falling fragments were piercing into his flesh. Everything was failing him. He moved about trembling and unable to grasp anything. He could not talk. Everything in him seemed to have come to a standstill. He had picked up a piece of rope and was going backward and forward, looking up. Then Pelle went up to him. "What are you going to do with that?" he asked harshly. Lasse let the rope fall from his hand and began to complain of the sadness and poverty of existence. One feather fell off here and another there, until at last you stood trampling in the mud like a featherless bird, old and worn out, and robbed of every hope of a happy old age. He went on complaining in this way in an undertone, and it eased him. Pelle made no response. He only thought of the wrong and the shame that had come upon them, and found no relief. Next morning he took his dinner and went off as usual, but when he was halfway to school he lay down under a thorn. There he lay, fuming and half frozen, until it was about the time when school would be over, when he went home. This he did for several days. Toward his father he was silent, almost angry. Lasse went about lamenting, and Pelle had enough with his own trouble. Each moved in his own world, and there was no bridge between. Neither of them had a kind word to say to the other. But one day when Pelle came stealing home in this way, Lasse received him with a radiant face and weak knees. "What on earth's the good of fretting?" he said, screwing up his face and turning his blinking eyes upon Pelle, for the first time since the bad news had come. "Look here at the new sweetheart I've found. Kiss her, laddie." And Lasse drew from the straw a bottle of gin and held it out toward him. Pelle pushed it angrily from him. "Oh, you're too grand, are you?" exclaimed Lasse. "Well, well, it would be a sin and a shame to waste good things upon you." He put the bottle to his lips and threw his head back. "Father, you shan't do that!" exclaimed Pelle, bursting into tears and shaking his father's arm so that the liquid splashed out. "Oh ho!" said Lasse in astonishment, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "She's uncommonly lively, ho ho!" He grasped the bottle with both hands and held it firmly, as if it had tried to get away from him. "So you're obstreperous, are you?" Then his eye fell upon Pelle. "And you're crying. Has anyone hurt you? Don't you know that your father's called Lasse Karlsson from Kungstrup? You needn't be afraid, for Lasse's here, and he'll make the whole world answer for it." Pelle saw that his father was quickly becoming more fuddled, and ought to be put to bed, for fear someone should come and find him lying there. "Come now, father," he begged. "Yes, I'll go now. I'll make him pay for it. If it's old Beelzebub himself, you needn't cry." Lasse was making for the yard. Pelle stood in front of him. "Now you must come with me, father. There's no one to make pay for anything." "Isn't there? And yet you're crying. But the farmer shall answer to me for all these years. Yes, my fine landed gentleman, with your nose turned up at every one." This made Pelle afraid. "But father, father!" he cried. "Don't go up there. He'll be in such a rage he'll turn us out. Remember, you're drunk." "Yes, of course I'm drunk, but there's no harm in me." He stood fumbling with the hook that fastened the lower half of the door. It was wrong to lay a hand upon one's own father, but now Pelle was compelled to set aside all such scruples. He took a firm hold of the old man's collar. "Now you come with me," he said, and drew him along toward their room. Lasse laughed and hiccuped and struggled, clutched hold of everything that he could lay hands on, the posts and the animals' tails, while Pelle dragged him along. He had hold of him behind, and was half carrying him. In the doorway they stuck fast, as the old man held on with both hands, and Pelle had to leave go of him, and knock his arms away so that he fell, and then drag him along, and on to the bed. Lasse laughed foolishly all the time, as if it were a game. Once or twice, when Pelle's back was turned, he tried to get up. His eyes had almost disappeared, but there was a cunning expression about his mouth, and he was like a naughty child. Suddenly he fell back in a heavy sleep. The next day was a school holiday, so there was no need for Pelle to hide himself. Lasse was ashamed, and crept about with an air of humility. He must have had quite a clear idea of what had happened the day before, for suddenly he touched Pelle's arm. "You're like Noah's good son, that covered up his father's shame," he said. "But Lasse's a beast. It's been a hard blow on me, as you may well believe. But I know quite well that it doesn't mend matters to drink oneself silly. It's a badly buried trouble that one has to lay with gin, and what's hidden in the snow comes up in the thaw, as the saying is." Pelle made no answer. "How do people take it?" asked Lasse cautiously. He had now got so far as to have a thought for the shameful side of the matter. "I don't think they know about it yet here on the farm, but what do they say outside?" "How should I know?" answered Pelle sulkily. "Then you've heard nothing. Do you suppose I go to school to be jeered at by them all?" Pelle was almost crying again. "Then you've been wandering about and let your father believe you'd gone to school. That wasn't right of you, but I won't find fault with you, considering all the disgrace I've brought upon you. But suppose you get into trouble for playing truant, even if you don't deserve it. Misfortunes go hand in hand, and evils multiply like lice in a fur coat. We must think what we're about, we two. We mustn't let things go all to pieces." Lasse walked quickly into their room, and returned with the bottle, took out the cork, and let the gin run slowly out into the gutter. Pelle looked wonderingly at him. "God forgive me for abusing his gifts," said Lasse, "but it's a bad tempter to have at hand when you've a sore heart. And now if I give you my word that you shall never again see me as I was yesterday, won't you have a try at school again tomorrow, and try to get over it gradually? We might get into trouble with the magistrate himself if you keep on staying away, for there's a heavy punishment for that sort of thing in this country." Pelle promised and kept his word, but he was prepared for the worst, and secretly slipped a knuckle-duster into his pocket that Eric had used in his palmy days, when he went to open-air fêtes and other places where one had to strike a blow for one's girl. It was not required, however, for the boys were generally taken up with a ship that had had to be run aground to prevent her sinking, and now lay discharging her cargo of wheat into the boats of the village. The wheat already lay in the harbor in great piles, wet and swollen with the salt water. And a few days later, when this had become stale, something happened which put a stop forever to Pelle's school attendance. The children were busy at arithmetic, chattering and clattering with their slates, and Fris was sitting as usual in his place, with his head against the wall and his hands resting on the desk. His dim eyes were somewhere out in space, and not a movement betrayed that he was alive. It was his usual position, and he had sat thus ever since playtime. The children grew restless. It was nearly time for them to go home. A farmer's son who had a watch held it up so that Pelle could see it, and said too, aloud. They noisily put away their slates and began to fight, but Fris, who generally awoke at the noise of departure, did not stir. Then they tramped out, and in passing, one of the girls, out of mischief, stroked the master's hand. She started back in fear. "He's quite cold," she said, shuddering and drawing back behind the others. They stood in a semicircle round the desk and tried to see into Fris's half-closed eyes, and then Pelle went up the 2 steps and laid his hand upon his master's shoulder. "We're going home," he said in an unnatural voice. Fris's arm dropped stiffly down from the desk, and Pelle had to support his body. "He's dead." The words passed like a shiver over the children's lips. Fris was dead, dead at his post, as the honest folks of the parish expressed it. Pelle had finished his schooling for good, and could breathe freely. He helped his father at home, and they were happy together, and drew together again now that there was no third person to stand between them. The jibes from the others on the farm were not worth taking notice of. Lasse had been a long time on the farm, and knew too much about each of them, so that he could talk back. He sunned himself in Pelle's gently childlike nature, and kept up a continual chatter. One thing he was always coming back to. "I ought to be glad I had you, for if you hadn't held back that time when I was bent upon moving down to Madam Olsen's, we should have been in the wrong box. I should think he'd have killed us in anger. You were my good angel, as you always have been." Lasse's words had the pleasant effect of caresses on Pelle. He was happy in it all, and was more of a child than his years would have indicated. But one Saturday he came home from the parson's altogether changed. He was as slow about everything as a dead herring, and did not go across to his dinner, but came straight in through the outer door, and threw himself face downward upon a bundle of hay. "What's the matter now?" asked Lasse, coming up to him. "Has anyone been unkind to you?" Pelle did not answer, but lay plucking at the hay. Lasse was going to turn his face up to him, but Pelle buried it in the hay. "Won't you trust your own father? You know I've no other wish in the world but for your good." Lasse's voice was sad. "I'm going to be turned out of the confirmation class," Pelle managed to say, and then burrowed into the hay to keep back his tears. "Oh, no, surely not." Lasse began to tremble. "Whatever have you done?" "I've half killed the parson's son." "Oh, that's about the worst thing you could have done. Lift your hand against the parson's son. I'm sure he must have deserved it, but still you shouldn't have done it. Unless he's accused you of thieving, for no honest man need stand that from anyone, not even the king himself." He called you Madam Olsen's concubine." Pelle had some difficulty in getting this out. Lasse's mouth grew hard, and he clenched his fists. "Oh, he did! Oh, did he? If I had him here, I'd kick his guts out, the young monkey. I hope you gave him something he'll remember for a long time." "Oh, no, it wasn't very much, for he wouldn't stand up to me. He threw himself down and screamed, and then the parson came." For a little while Lasse's face was disfigured with rage, and he kept uttering threats. Then he turned to Pelle. "And they've turned you out, only because you stood up for your old father. I'm always to bring misfortune upon you, though I'm only thinking of your good. But what shall we do now?" "I won't stay here any longer," said Pelle decidedly. "No, let's get away from here. Nothing has ever grown on this farm for us two but wormwood. Perhaps there are new happy days waiting for us out there, and there are parsons everywhere. If we two work together at some good work out there, we shall earn a peck of money. Then one day we'll go up to a parson and throw down 100 kronas in front of his face, and it'd be funny if he didn't confirm you on the spot, and perhaps let himself be kicked into the bargain. Those kind of folk are very fond of money." Lasse had grown more erect in his anger, and had a keen look in his eyes. He walked quickly along the foddering passage, and threw the things about carelessly, for Pelle's adventurous proposal had infected him with youth. In the intervals of their work, they collected all their little things and packed the green chest. "What a surprise it'll be tomorrow morning when they come here and find the nest empty," said Pelle gaily. Lasse chuckled. Their plan was to take shelter with Kalle for a day or two, while they took a survey of what the world offered. When everything was done in the evening, they took the green chest between them and stole out through the outside door into the field. The chest was heavy, and the darkness did not make walking easier. They moved on a little way, changed hands, and rested. "We've got the night before us," said Lasse cheerfully. He was quite animated, and while they sat resting upon the chest, talked about everything that awaited them. When he came to a standstill, Pelle began. Neither of them had made any distinct plans for their future. They simply expected a fairy story itself, with its inconceivable surprises. All the definite possibilities that they were capable of picturing to themselves fell so far short of that which must come, that they left it alone and abandoned themselves to what lay beyond their powers of foresight. Lasse was not sure-footed in the dark, and had more and more frequently to put down his burden. He grew weary and breathless, and the cheerful words died away upon his lips. "Ah, how heavy it is," he sighed. "What a lot of rubbish you do scrape together in the course of time." Then he sat down upon the chest, quite out of breath. He could do no more. "If only we'd had something to pick us up a little," he said faintly. "And it's so dark and gloomy tonight." "Help me to get it on my back," said Pelle, "and I'll carry it a little way." Lasse would not at first, but gave in, and they went on again, he running on in front and giving warning of ditches and walls. "But suppose Brother Kalle can't take us in," he said suddenly. "He's sure to be able to. There's grandmother's bed. That's big enough for two." "But suppose we can't get anything to do, then we shall be a burden on him." "Oh, we shall get something to do. There's a scarcity of laborers everywhere." "Yes, they'll jump at you, but I'm really too old to offer myself out." Lasse had lost all hope, and was undermining Pelle's too. "I can't do any more," said Pelle, letting the chest down. They stood with arms hanging, and stared into the darkness, at nothing in particular. Lasse showed no desire to take hold again, and Pelle was now tired out. The night lay dark around them, and its all-enveloping loneliness made it seem as if they too were floating alone in space. "Well, we ought to be getting on," exclaimed Pelle, taking a handle of the chest. But as Lasse did not move, he dropped it and sat down. They sat back to back, and neither could find the right words to utter, and the distance between them seemed to increase. Lasse shivered with the night cold. "If only we were at home in our good bed," he sighed. Pelle was almost wishing he had been alone, for then he would have gone on to the end. The old man was just as heavy to drag along as the chest. "Do you know, I think I'll go back again," said Lasse at last, in crestfallen tone. "I'm afraid I'm not able to tread uncertain paths, and you'll never be confirmed if we go on like this. Suppose we go back, and get Kongstrup to put in a good word for us with the parson." Lasse stood and held one handle of the chest. Pelle sat on as if he had not heard, and then he silently took hold, and they toiled along on their weary way, homeward across the fields. Every other minute, Pelle was tired and had to rest. Now that they were going home, Lasse was the more enduring. "I think I could carry it a little way alone, if you'd help me up with it," he said, but Pelle would not hear of it. "Yah!" sighed Lasse with pleasure, when they once more stood in the warmth of the cow stable and heard the animals breathing in indolent well-being. "It's comfortable here. It's just like coming into one's own home. I think I should know this stable again by the air, if they led me into it blindfold anywhere in the world." And now they were home again. Pelle too could not help thinking that it really was pleasant. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Pelle the Conqueror, Volume 1, by Martin Andersen Nexo, translated by Jesse Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On Sunday morning, between watering and midday feed, Lasse and Pelle ascended the high stone steps. They took off their wooden shoes in the passage and stood and shook themselves outside the door of the office. Their gray stocking feet were full of chaff and earth. Lasse raised his hand to knock, but drew it back. "Have you wiped your nose properly?" he asked in a whisper, with a look of anxiety on his face. Pelle performed the operation once more, and gave a final polish with the sleeve of his blouse. Lasse lifted his hand again. He looked greatly oppressed. "You might keep quiet then," he said irritably to Pelle, who was standing as still as a mouse. Lasse's knuckles were poised in the air 2 or 3 times before they fell upon the door, and then he stood with his forehead close to the panel and listened. "There's no one there," he whispered irresolutely. "Just go in," exclaimed Pelle. "We can't stand here all day." "Then you can go first, if you think you know better how to behave," said Lasse, offended. Pelle quickly opened the door and went in. There was no one in the office, but the door was open into the drawing-room, and the sound of Kongstrup's comfortable breathing came thence. "Who's there?" he asked. "It's Lasse and Pelle," answered Lasse, in a voice that did not sound altogether brave. "Will you come in here?" Kongstrup was lying on the sofa, reading a magazine, and on the table beside him stood a pile of old magazines and a plateful of little cakes. He did not raise his eyes from the book, not even while his hand went out to the plate for something to put in his mouth. He lay nibbling and swallowing while he read, and never looked at Lasse and Pelle, or asked them what they wanted, or said anything to give them a start. It was like being sent out to plow, without knowing where. He must have been in the middle of something very exciting. "Well, what do you want?" asked Kongstrup at last, in slow tones. "Well, the master must excuse us for coming like this about something that doesn't concern the farm, but as matters stand now, we've no one else to go to. And so I said to the laddie, Master won't be angry, I'm sure, for he's many a time been kind to us poor beggars, and that. Now, it's so in this world that even if you're a poor soul that's only fit to do others' dirty work, the Almighty's nevertheless given you a father's heart, and it hurts you to see the father's sin standing in the son's way." Lasse came to a standstill. He had thought it all out beforehand, and so arranged it that it should lead up, in a shrewd, dignified way, to the matter itself. But now it was all in a muddle, like a slattern's pocket handkerchief, and the farmer did not look as if he understood a single word of it. He lay there, taking a cake now and then, and looking helplessly toward the door. "It sometimes happens, too, that a man gets tired of the single state," began Lasse once more, but at once gave up trying to go on. No matter how he began, he went round and round the thing, and got no hold anywhere. And now Kongstrup began to read again. A tiny question from him might have led to the very middle of it, but he only filled his mouth full, and began munching quite hard. Lasse was outwardly disheartened, and inwardly angry, as he stood there and prepared to go. Pelle was staring about at the pictures and the old mahogany furniture, making up his mind about each thing. Suddenly energetic steps sounded through the rooms. The ear could follow their course right up from the kitchen. Kongstrup's eyes brightened, and Lasse straightened himself up. "Is that you too?" said Fru Kongstrup, in her decided way that indicated the manager. "But do sit down. Why didn't you offer them a seat, old man?" Lasse and Pelle found seats, and the mistress seated herself beside her husband, with her arm leaning upon his pillow. "How are you getting on, Kongstrup? Have you been resting?" she asked sympathetically, patting his shoulder. Kongstrup gave a little grunt that might have meant yes or no, or nothing at all. "And what about you two? Are you in need of money?" "No, it's the lad. He's to be dismissed from the confirmation class," answered Lasse simply. With the mistress, you couldn't help being decided. "Are you to be dismissed?" she exclaimed, looking at Pelle as an old acquaintance. "Then what have you been doing?" "Oh, I kicked the parson's son." "And what did you do that for?" Because he wouldn't fight, but threw himself down." Fru Kongstrup laughed and nudged her husband. "Yes, of course, but what had he done to you?" "He'd said bad things about Father Lasse." "What were the things?" Pelle looked hard at her. She meant to get to the bottom of everything. "I won't tell you," he said firmly. "Oh, very well, but then we can't do anything about it either." "I may just as well tell you," Lasse interrupted. "He called me Madam Olsen's concubine, from the Bible story, I suppose." Kongstrup tried to suppress a chuckle, as if someone had whispered a coarse joke in his ear, and he could not help it. The mistress herself was serious enough. "I don't think I understand," she said, and laid a repressing hand on her husband's arm. Lasse must explain. "It's because I was engaged to Madam Olsen in the village, who everyone thought was a widow, and then her husband came home the other day, and so they've given me that nickname round about, I suppose." Kongstrup began his suppressed laughter again, and Lasse blinked in distress at it. "Help yourselves to a cake," said Fru Kongstrup in a very loud voice, pushing the plate toward them. This silenced Kongstrup, and he lay and watched their assault upon the cake plate with an attentive eye. Fru Kongstrup sat tapping the table with her middle finger while they ate. "So that good boy Pelle got angry and kicked out, did he?" she said suddenly, her eyes flashing. "Yes, that's what he never ought to have done," answered Lasse plaintively. Fru Kongstrup fixed her eyes upon him. "No, for all the poorer birds are for is to be pecked at. Well, I prefer the bird that pecks back again and defends its nest, no matter how poor it is. Well, well, we shall see. And is that boy going to be confirmed? Why, of course. To think that I should be so forgetful. Then we must begin to think about his clothes." "That's 2 troubles got rid of," said Lasse when they went down to the stable again. "And did you notice how nicely I let her know that you were going to be confirmed? It was almost as if she'd found it out for herself. Now you'll see. You'll be as fine as a shop boy in your clothes. People like the master and mistress know what's needed when once they've opened their purse. Well, they got the whole truth straight. But confound it, they're no more than human beings. It's always best to speak out straight." Lasse could not forget how well it had turned out. Pelle let the old man boast. "Do you think I shall get leather shoes of them too?" he asked. "Yes, of course you will. And I shouldn't wonder if they made a confirmation party for you too. I say they, but it's her doing it all, and we may be thankful for that. Did you notice that she said we shall, and so on, always? It's nice of her, for he only lies there and eats and leaves everything to her. But what a good time he has! I think she'd go through fire to please him. But upon my word, she's master there. Well, well, I suppose we oughtn't to speak evil of anyone. To you, she's like your own mother." Fru Kongstrup said nothing about the result of her drive to the parson. It was not her way to talk about things afterward. But Lasse and Pelle once more trod the earth with a feeling of security. When she took up a matter, it was as good as arranged. One morning, later in the week, the tailor came limping in with his scissors, tape measure, and pressing iron, and Pelle had to go down to the servants' room, and was measured in every direction as if he had been a prize animal. Up to the present, he had always had his clothes made by guesswork. It was something new to have itinerant artisans at Stone Farm. Since Kongstrup had come into power, neither shoemaker nor tailor had ever set foot in the servants' room. This was a return to the good old farm customs, and placed Stone Farm once more on a footing with the other farms. The people enjoyed it, and as often as they could went down into the servants' room for a change of air and to hear one of the tailor's yarns. "It's the mistress who's at the head of things now," they said to one another. There was good peasant blood in her hands, and she brought things back into the good old ways. Pelle walked into the servants' room like a gentleman. He was fitted several times a day. He was fitted for 2 whole suits, one of which was for Rud, who was to be confirmed too. It would probably be the last thing that Rud and his mother would get at the farm, for Fru Kongstrup had carried her point, and they were to leave the cottage in May. They would never venture to set foot again in Stone Farm. Fru Kongstrup herself saw that they received what they were to have, but she did not give money if she could help it. Pelle and Rud were never together now, and they seldom went to the parson together. It was Pelle who had drawn back, as he had grown tired of being on the watch for Rud's continual little lies and treacheries. Pelle was taller and stronger than Rud, and his nature, perhaps because of his physical superiority, had taken more open ways. In ability to master a task or learn it by heart, Rud was also the inferior, but on the other hand, he could bewilder Pelle and the other boys if he only got a hold with his practical common sense. On the great day itself, Karl Johan drove Pelle and Lasse in the little one-horse carriage. "We're fine folk today," said Lasse with a beaming face. He was quite confused, although he had not tasted anything strong. There was a bottle of gin lying in the chest to treat the men when the sacred ceremony was over, but Lasse was not the man to drink anything before he went to church. Pelle had not touched food. God's word would take best effect in that condition. Pelle was radiant, too, in spite of his hunger. He was in brand-new twill, so new that it crackled every time he moved. On his feet he wore elastic-sided shoes that had once belonged to Kongstrup himself. They were too large, but "there's no difficulty with a sausage that's too long," as Lasse said. He put in thick soles and paper in the toes, and Pelle put on 2 pairs of stockings, and then the shoes fitted as if they had been cast for his foot. On his head he wore a blue cap that he had chosen himself down at the shop. It allowed room for growing and rested on his ears, which, for the occasion, were as red as 2 roses. Round the cap was a broad ribbon, in which were woven rakes, scythes, and flails, interlaced with sheaves all the way round. "It's a good thing you came," said Pelle, as they drove up to the church and found themselves among so many people. Lasse had almost had to give up the thought of coming, for the man who was going to look after the animals while he was away had to go off at the last moment for the veterinary surgeon. But Karna came and offered to water and give the midday feed, although neither could truthfully say that they had behaved as they ought to have done with her. "Have you got that thing now?" whispered Lasse when they were inside the church. Pelle felt in his pocket and nodded. The little round piece of lignum vitae that was to carry him over the difficulties of the day lay there. "Then just answer loud and straight out," whispered Lasse as he slipped into a pew in the background. Pelle did answer straight out, and to Lasse his voice sounded really well through the spacious church. And the parson did absolutely nothing to revenge himself, but treated Pelle exactly as he did the others. At the most solemn part of the ceremony, Lasse thought of Karna and how touching her devotion was. He scolded himself in an undertone and made a solemn vow she should not sigh any longer in vain. For a whole month indeed, Lasse's thoughts had been occupied with Karna, now favorably, now unfavorably. But at this solemn moment, when Pelle was just taking the great step into the future, and Lasse's feelings were touched in so many ways, the thought of Karna's devotion broke over him as something sad, like a song of slighted affection that at last, has justice done to it. Lasse shook hands with Pelle. "Good luck and a blessing," he said in a trembling voice. The wish also embraced his own vow, and he had some difficulty in keeping silence, respecting his determination. He was so moved. The words were heard on all sides, and Pelle went round and shook hands with his comrades. Then they drove home. "It all went uncommonly well for you today," said Lasse proudly. "And now you're a man, you know." "Yes, now you must begin to look about for a sweetheart," said Karl Johan. Pelle only laughed. In the afternoon they had a holiday. Pelle had first to go up to his master and mistress to thank them for his clothes, and receive their congratulations. Fru Kongstrup gave him red currant wine and cake, and the farmer gave him a 2 krone piece. Then they went up to Kalle's by the quarry. Pelle was to exhibit himself in his new clothes and say good-bye to them. There was only a fortnight to May Day. Lasse was going to take the opportunity of secretly obtaining information concerning a house that was for sale on the heath. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Pelle the Conqueror, Volume 1, by Martin Andersen Nexo, translated by Jesse Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. They still talked about it every day for the short time that was left. Lasse, who had always had the thought of leaving in his mind, and had only stayed on and on, year after year, because the boy's welfare demanded it, was slow to move now that there was nothing to hold him back. He was unwilling to lose Pelle, and did all he could to keep him, but nothing would induce him to go out into the world again. "Stay here," he said persuasively, "and we'll talk to the mistress, and she'll take you on for a proper wage. You're both strong and handy, and she's always looked upon you with a friendly eye." But Pelle would not take service with the farmer. It gave no position and no prospects. He wanted to be something great, and there was no possibility of that in the country. He would be following cows all his days. He would go to the town, perhaps still farther, across the sea to Copenhagen. "You'd better come too," he said, "and then we shall get rich all the quicker, and be able to buy a big farm." "Yes, yes," said Lasse, slowly nodding his head. "That's 1 for me and 2 for yourself. But what the parson preaches doesn't always come to pass. We might become penniless. Who knows what the future may bring?" "Oh, I shall manage," said Pelle, nodding confidently. "Do you mean to say I can't turn my hand to anything I like?" "And I didn't give notice in time either," said Lasse, to excuse himself. "Then run away." But Lasse would not do that. "No, I'll stay and work toward getting something for myself about here," he said, a little evasively. "It would be nice for you, too, to have a home that you could visit now and then, and if you didn't get on out there, it wouldn't be bad to have something to fall back upon. You might fall ill, or something else might happen. The world's not to be relied upon. You have to have a hard skin all over out there." Pelle did not answer. That about the home sounded nice enough, and he understood quite well that it was Karna's person that weighed down the other end of the balance. Well, she'd put all his clothes in order for his going away, and she'd always been a good soul. He had nothing against that. It would be hard to live apart from Father Lasse, but Pelle felt he must go, away. The spring seemed to shout the word in his ears. He knew every rock in the landscape and every tree, yes, every twig on the trees as well. There was nothing more here that could fill his blue eyes and long ears and satisfy his mind. The day before May Day, they packed Pelle's things. Lasse knelt before the green chest. Every article was carefully folded and remarked upon before it was placed in the canvas bag that was to serve Pelle as a traveling trunk. "Now remember not to wear your stockings too long before you mend them," said Lasse, putting mending wool on one side. "He who mends his things in time is spared half the work and all the disgrace." "I shan't forget that," said Pelle quietly. Lasse was holding a folded shirt in his hand. "The one you've got on's just been washed," he said reflectively. "But one can't tell. 2 shirts'll almost be too little if you're away, won't they? You must take one of mine. I can always manage to get another by the time I want to change. And remember, you must never go longer than a fortnight. You who are young and healthy might easily get vermin and be jeered at by the whole town. Such a thing would never be tolerated in anyone who wants to get on. At the worst, you can do a little washing or yourself. You could go down to the shore in the evening, if that was all." "Do they wear wooden shoes in the town?" asked Pelle. "Not people who want to get on. I think you'd better let me keep the wooden shoes, and you take my boots instead. They always look nice, even if they're old. You'd better wear them when you go tomorrow, and save your good shoes." The new clothes were laid at the top of the bag, wrapped in an old blouse to keep them clean. "Now I think we've got everything in," said Lasse, with a searching glance into the green chest. There was not much left in it. "Very well, we'll tie it up in God's name, and pray that you may arrive safely, wherever you decide to go." Lasse tied up the sack. He was anything but happy. "You must say good-bye nicely to everyone on the farm, so that they won't have anything to scratch my eyes out for afterward," said Lasse after a little. "And I should like you to thank Karna nicely for having put everything in such good order. It isn't everyone who'd have bothered." "Yes, I'll do that," said Pelle in a low voice. He did not seem to be able to speak out properly today. Pelle was up and dressed at daybreak. Mist lay over the sea, and prophesied well for the day. He went about well scrubbed and combed, and looked at everything with wide-open eyes, and with his hands in his pockets. The blue clothes, which he had gone to his confirmation classes in, had been washed and newly mangled, and he still looked very well in them. And the tabs of the old leather boots, which were a relic of Lasse's prosperous days, stuck out almost as much as his ears. He said his "good-bye and thank you for all your kindness" to everybody on the farm, even Erik, and he had had a good meal of bacon. Now he was going about the stable, collecting himself, shaking the bull by the horns, and letting the calves suck his fingers. It was a sort of farewell, too. The cows put their noses close up to him, and breathed a long, comfortable breath when he passed, and the bull playfully tossed its head at him. And close behind him went Lasse. He did not say very much, but he always kept near the boy. It was so good to be here, and the feeling sank gently over Pelle every time a cow licked herself, or the warm vapor rose from freshly falling dung. Every sound was like a mother's caress, and everything was a familiar toy, with which a bright world could be built. Upon the posts all round were pictures that he had cut upon them. Lasse had smeared them over with dirt again, in case the farmer should come and say they were spoiling everything. Pelle was not thinking, but went about in a dreamy state. It all sank so warmly and heavily into his child's mind. He had taken out his knife and took hold of the bull's horn, as if he were going to carve something on it. "He won't let you do that," said Lasse, surprised. "Try one of the bullocks instead." But Pelle returned his knife to his pocket. He had not intended to do anything. He strolled along the foddering passage without aim or object. Lasse came up and took his hand. "You'd better stay here a little longer," he said. "We're so comfortable." But this put life into Pelle. He fixed his big, faithful eyes upon his father, and then went down to their room. Lasse followed him. "In God's name, then, if it has to be," he said huskily, and took hold of the sack to help Pelle get it onto his back. Pelle held out his hand. "Goodbye, and thank you, father, for all your kindness," he added gently. "Yes, yes, yes, yes," said Lasse, shaking his head. It was all he was able to say. He went out with Pelle past the outhouses, and there stopped, while Pelle went along the dikes with his sack on his back, up toward the high road. 2 or 3 times he turned and nodded. Lasse, overcome, stood gazing, with his hand shading his eyes. He had never looked so old before. Out in the fields they were driving the seed harrow. Stone Farm was early with it this year. Kongstrup and his wife were strolling along arm in arm beside a ditch. Every now and then they stopped and she pointed. They must have been talking about the crop. She leaned against him when they walked. She had really found rest in her affection now. Now Lasse turned and went in. How forlorn he looked. Pelle felt a quick desire to throw down the sack and run back and say something nice to him. But before he could do so, the impulse had disappeared upon the fresh morning breeze. His feet carried him upon the straight way. Away, away. Up on a ridge, the bailiff was stepping out of field, and close behind him walked Erik, imitating him with foolish gestures. On a level with the edge of the rocks, Pelle came to the wide high road. Here, he knew, Stone Farm and its lands would be lost to sight, and he put down his sack. There were the sandbanks by the sea, with every treetop visible. There was the fir tree that the yellow hammer always built in. The stream ran milk-white after the heavy thaw, and the meadow was beginning to grow green. But the cairn was gone. Good people had removed it secretly when Niels Kohler was drowned, and the girl was expected out of prison. And the farm stood out clearly in the morning light, with its high white dwelling house, the long range of barns, and all the outhouses. Every spot down there shone so familiarly toward him. The hardships he had suffered were forgotten, or only showed up the comforts in stronger relief. Pelle's childhood had been happy by virtue of everything. It had been a song mingled with weeping. Weeping falls into tones as well as joy, and heard from a distance it becomes a song. And as Pelle gazed down upon his childhood's world, they were only pleasant memories that gleamed toward him through the bright air. Nothing else existed, or ever had done so. He had seen enough of hardship and misfortune, but had come well out of everything. Nothing had harmed him. With a child's veracity, he had found nourishment in it all, and now he stood here, healthy and strong, equipped with the prophets, the judges, the apostles, the 10 Commandments, and 120 hymns, and turned an open, perspiring, victor's brow toward the world. Before him lay the land, sloping richly toward the south, bounded by the sea. Far below stood 2 tall black chimneys against the sea as background, and still farther south lay the town. Away from it ran the paths of the sea to Sweden and Copenhagen. This was the world, the great wide world itself. Pelle became ravenously hungry at the sight of the great world, and the first thing he did was to sit down upon the ridge of the hill, with a view both backward and forward, and eat all the food Karna had given him for the whole day, so his stomach would have nothing more to trouble about. He rose refreshed, got the sack onto his back, and set off downward to conquer the world, pouring forth a song at the top of his voice into the bright air as he went. A stranger I must wander among the Englishmen, with African black Negroes my lot it may be thrown, and then upon this earth there are Portuguese found too, and every kind of nation, under heaven's sky so blue. The End of Pelle the Conqueror, Volume 1, by Martin Andersen Nexo, translated by Jesse Muir.